Welcome to Skytech-Lens. The United States Supreme Court is set to decide a case that could redefine the balance of power in American government. At the heart of the dispute, President Trump's sweeping tariffs imposed in 2025 under the guise of national security, and the question of whether a president can unilaterally tax imports. Small businesses and states argue these tariffs threaten their survival and bypass Congress's constitutional authority over taxation. The outcome will shape the future of executive power, American commerce, and the very structure of our democracy. As the justices prepare to rule, the nation waits for a decision that could redraw the boundaries of presidential authority for generations. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods, historically used to raise revenue and protect domestic industries. While Congress has always held the power to set tariffs, President Trump's administration invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, to bypass the legislative process. The administration claims national emergencies like drug trafficking and trade deficits justify unilateral action. Critics argue IEPA was never meant to allow the president to impose broad taxes, only to regulate specific threats. The distinction between regulation and taxation is crucial. Regulation manages activity, while taxation raises revenue. Trump's tariffs, costing American households thousands, look and feel like taxes, raising the central constitutional question now before the courts. This unprecedented use of executive power has ignited fierce legal and economic debate. In the opening months of 2025, President Trump stunned both allies and rivals by launching two aggressive waves of tariffs. The first round specifically targeted major trading partners, Canada, Mexico, and China, countries that have long been central to America's global supply chains and economic relationships. The move sent shockwaves through international markets with immediate reactions from foreign governments and U.S. businesses alike. Within weeks, the administration expanded these tariffs to cover nearly all imports worldwide, effectively reshaping the landscape of global trade. This sweeping action disrupted established supply routes and forced companies to reconsider sourcing and pricing strategies. The White House justified these unprecedented measures by citing urgent national security concerns. Officials pointed to rising drug trafficking across borders and persistent trade deficits, framing the tariffs as emergency responses under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. The administration argued that these threats required immediate and decisive action. However, critics from across the political spectrum quickly pushed back. Many saw the national emergency rationale as a thinly veiled pretext for protectionism, and a dramatic, even dangerous expansion of executive authority. Business leaders warned of higher costs and economic instability, while legal scholars questioned the constitutional limits of presidential power. The administration's legal defense rests on a broad interpretation of IEPA and previous court cases, insisting that the president has wide latitude to use tariffs as leverage in times of declared emergency. They argue that past precedents support the executive's ability to act swiftly when national interests are at stake. Yet, historians and legal experts note that no previous president has ever invoked IEPA to impose such sweeping, open-ended tariffs on nearly all imports. This marks a significant departure from how executive power has traditionally been exercised in economic matters. Legal experts highlight the major questions doctrine, a principle stating that Congress must clearly authorize any vast new executive powers. They argue that such a dramatic shift in trade policy should require explicit legislative approval, not just a broad reading of existing law. Challengers contend that IEPA contains no such clear statement granting the president this level of authority, making Trump's move a dangerous overreach that could set a precedent for future executive actions far beyond its original intent. Now the courts face a pivotal decision. Can the president transform a targeted sanctions law into a sweeping tool for nationwide economic policy, or will the judiciary reign in this bold assertion of executive power? The core of the legal battle is the Constitution's clear grant of taxing and trade powers to Congress. Plaintiffs argue Trump's tariffs are, in effect, a massive tax hike imposed without congressional approval, undermining the separation of powers. The administration counters that Congress delegated broad authority to the president through IEPA to act swiftly in emergencies. The Supreme Court must decide if Congress truly intended to hand over such sweeping power, or if the president has overstepped. The major questions doctrine looms large. Did Congress speak clearly enough to allow the president to set national tax policy alone? The answer will define the limits of executive action for years to come. For small and medium-sized businesses, Trump's tariffs are an existential threat, not an abstract policy debate. Companies like Learning Resources, VOS Selections, and Terry Precision Cycling face devastating costs, forced to choose between raising prices, cutting staff, or closing their doors. The upfront tariffs erase profit margins and inject radical uncertainty into long-term planning. These business owners argue that executive-imposed tariffs create chaos, making it impossible to invest or grow. Their lawsuit is a desperate plea for stability and the rule of law, demanding that major economic changes go through Congress, not presidential decree. They seek not just relief from current costs, but a return to predictable legislated trade policy. Their fight is about survival, and about restoring the constitutional process that underpins American commerce. The stakes for these businesses are immediate and deeply personal. The legal fight began in the Court of International Trade, a specialized court in New York City that handles complex disputes over trade and tariffs. Here, a coalition of businesses, importers, and legal experts came together to challenge the administration's sweeping use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. Their argument was clear. IEPA was designed for targeted national security threats, not as a tool for broad economic policy or to reshape the nation's trade landscape. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as lawyers presented their cases, emphasizing the importance of checks and balances in the American system. In May 2025, after months of deliberation and intense legal debate, the court sided with the challengers. The judge's ruling was decisive. Trump's tariffs imposed under IEPA had exceeded the president's authority and infringed on Congress's constitutional powers to regulate commerce and impose taxes. This decision sent shockwaves through the legal and business communities, raising questions about the limits of executive power. Meanwhile, a parallel case unfolded in the D.C. District Court. There, another group of plaintiffs argued that the power to regulate international trade is fundamentally different from the power to tax. The court agreed, reinforcing the idea that the executive branch cannot bypass Congress when it comes to imposing broad economic measures. Both courts found that the administration had misused IEPA, drawing a sharp distinction between targeted sanctions meant for specific threats and sweeping national tariffs that affect the entire economy. The rulings underscored the importance of adhering to the original intent of the law and respecting the separation of powers. However, the government was quick to respond. Refusing to accept defeat, federal lawyers filed appeals, and the lower court victories were immediately put on hold, leaving businesses and policymakers in a state of uncertainty. Despite the setbacks, these early rulings set a strong legal foundation for the challengers. Their arguments had been validated in court, energizing their legal teams and supporters. Yet everyone knew the fight was far from over, and the stakes were only getting higher. The next phase was a high-stakes appeal to the federal circuit, where experienced appellate judges would weigh the constitutional questions at the heart of the case. The outcome would have far-reaching consequences, with the nation's economic future and the balance of governmental power hanging in the balance. As the legal battle escalated, the stage was set for a potential constitutional showdown at the highest levels, possibly even reaching the Supreme Court. The eyes of the nation and the world were watching closely. The Trump administration appealed to the federal circuit, seeking to keep the tariffs in place during the legal battle. The court granted a stay, meaning businesses had to keep paying the tariffs while the case was reviewed. Oral arguments drew intense scrutiny, with judges questioning the seemingly limitless power the administration claimed under IEPA. The panel appeared wary of endorsing such a sweeping expansion of executive authority. As of late August 2025, the nation awaited the federal circuit's decision, a pivotal moment that could force the Supreme Court's hand. The outcome would either cement or challenge the president's power to unilaterally reshape trade policy. No matter the federal circuit's ruling, the Supreme Court is almost certain to decide the fate of Trump's tariffs. This case has far-reaching implications, not just for the current administration, but for the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches of government. The justices declined to fast-track the case, preferring the normal appeals process, but the stakes are too high to ignore. The decision they make will resonate through the corridors of power and could redefine the scope of presidential authority for generations to come. The next key date, September 29, 2025, when the court will consider whether to hear the case. This date is crucial, as it will determine the timeline for any potential changes to the current tariff policies. If the court sides with Trump, it would grant future presidents sweeping power to impose tariffs by declaring emergencies, shifting economic authority from Congress to the White House. This could lead to a significant shift in how economic policies are implemented in the United States. If the court rules for the businesses, it would reaffirm Congress's primacy over taxation and trade, forcing presidents to seek legislative approval for major tariff changes. This would maintain the traditional checks and balances that have been a cornerstone of American governance. The decision will set a precedent for the separation of powers and the limits of executive action. It will be a landmark ruling that could either consolidate or disperse power within the federal government. The nation's economic and constitutional future hangs in the balance. The outcome will not only affect current policies but will also shape the framework within which future administrations operate, making this one of the most significant legal battles in recent history. The Trump tariff case has become a defining test of American constitutional order. At stake is not just the price of imports, but the architecture of government itself. Can a president unilaterally impose sweeping taxes by invoking emergency powers? The Supreme Court's ruling will shape the powers of future presidents and the role of Congress for decades. A win for the administration would entrench executive authority and economic volatility. A win for the challengers would restore legislative primacy and stability. Beyond economics, the case is a test of the rule of law and the separation of powers. The final verdict will draw a new line in the sand, defining the limits of power in a modern democracy. The nation awaits a decision that will echo through history. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel now for more updates. Thanks.